Today I want to talk about soldering iron tip care because this is something that I think is extremely important, especially when you're just starting to do the correct way so that you don't waste your money buying lots of different kinds of tips. And more importantly, so you don't waste your time, because not having a correctly tinned tip is going to be extremely frustrating, especially as a beginner. You're going to have issues like the solder balling up and not sticking to the tip. You're going to have issues with heat transfer from the tip into the board that you're working on. I see a lot of posts on Reddit and other forums and stuff where beginners are saying they have their soldering iron at maximum temperature and they still can't get the solder to melt and stuff like that. So today I want to do a deep dive into how to properly take care of your iron tips and how to make them last for a really long time, like years. So a lot of what I'm going to say applies to both of these types of iron tips, but we are going to specifically talk about the structure of C245 or C210 tips, and I'm going to talk about why I prefer these and the irons that they generally come with for the purposes of soldering iron tip care. However, a lot of the same methods I'm going to talk about here just apply to like any soldering iron tip, really. So I just wanted to mention that out of the gate, even though we are going to be breaking down these particular tips and how they work. This video will still be helpful for you if you don't have a cartridge style iron and you just have one like this. This conical tip right here is actually brand new, and we're going to use this in a second. But I wanted to show you these two, which I've been using for over a year now, and you can see just how perfect they look still. So take a look at just how nice these tips still look even after hundreds and hundreds of repairs with these things. This is my C210 knife tip and this is my C245 knife tip. And for this particular iron, these are the only knife tips I have ever used with this iron. And I only really use knife tips. I love knife tips. In my opinion, it's just an extremely versatile shape. Recently, I've just been using the C245 knife tip and not so much the C210 one because it's a little bit more powerful and it's essentially just like the same size. You can see the tip itself is almost exactly the same size. However, they are both in great condition and I've been using both of them for quite a long time now. So I just wanted to prove a point that I'm going to be showing you a very, very simple routine I always do with my iron to keep my tips this nice. And here's proof that it works. I haven't changed these particular tips in over a year, and this particular tip I haven't changed in 5 or 6 years. So this one's also looking really solid. I actually probably didn't tin it enough when I put it away last time. We're going to be talking about that. But actually, it doesn't look too horrible. I've had this tip for a long time and been using this on my Hakko close to when I got it. So again, proof that if you follow the tips and instructions that I give you in this video, you can make these things last for years and years and years. So before we actually go over the do's and don'ts for soldering iron tip care, I do want to show you guys a little diagram here. I do want to just quickly mention that all soldering iron tips are made a little bit differently and different brands do different things. So the layers I'm going to be talking about here are generally like the shared layers between the different kinds of tips. There are sometimes going to be 1 or 2 extra layers, but I just want to go over the consistencies with these cartridge style tips just to help you guys understand why the do's and don'ts actually apply. So I drew a really rough cross section of a knife tip here because it's the best soldering iron tip shape in my opinion, but maybe that's controversial. But anyways, this is the heating element in the middle. It's not actually red. I just made it red just to make it obvious that it's the heating element. And then you're going to have the thermocouple, which is the temperature sensor effectively somewhere close to the tip here in order to tell the soldering iron station what temperature the tip is at. And this is why these particular cartridge style tips are so accurate, is because the heating element and the thermocouple are embedded in the actual tip itself. Whereas with an iron like this, that is not at all the case. I just wanted to point that out. So generally the first layer around this heating element is going to be this copper core. So copper is used here because it's extremely thermally conductive. In other words, it's extremely efficient at spreading out heat. This is why copper is used in things like heat sinks. So we got a copper core in order to sort of transfer the heat from the heating element to the tip in an efficient way. And then between the copper core and the outer layers of the iron tip, we actually have a nickel plating inside. So this nickel plating here is essentially a barrier between the copper core and the outside material like iron and chrome. And this is mainly here to stop the copper from diffusing over time into the chrome or iron layers on the outside. So you can think of it as sort of like an insulation layer between the heating element slash copper and the outside layers. Otherwise, you know, the tip is going to break down faster. And then we have this sort of chrome outer layer, and this is sometimes steel on top of this and stuff. Again, there's all sorts of ways you can make soldering iron tips, but this chrome layer or plating really is on the parts of the iron tip that are non-wettable. And when I say non-wettable, it just means that the solder doesn't stick to this particular part of the tip. So if you look look at the actual iron tip here, you see like this whole area here up until the very tip of the iron is actually all like oxidized and darker than the shiny tip here. And we're going to go over why this is shiny in a moment. But you have this sort of section here and all of this, which is non-wettable. It's designed to not take solder. So the whole tip is not designed to take solder. If you're ever confused why solder only sticks to a part of the tip, that's why. It's because this whole area here is designed to not take solder. This is a bit more obvious. If you look at a brand new tip, you can see there's a very clear line here between the wettable area of the iron tip and the non-wettable area. So this over here is going to be, something like chrome that is preventing solder from climbing up and also preventing the solder from going into the tip and eating away at the copper and stuff like that. So again, this outer layer here is non-wettable, and then you have the very tip here, which is made of iron, and this is the only wettable surface, or the only surface on the iron that solder is going to stick to. So this part is actually made of iron, and it is the wettable surface of the tip, and that's sort of your working area, the area that you're using to apply heat to the board. You don't ever want to really be using like this part of the iron to apply heat into the board, because it's going to be very poor at transferring heat into things. This is going to do a much better job here. So I just wanted to very quickly go over the general structure of a C245 iron tip and why certain like metals are being used. And you're going to see exactly why this applies in a moment here. So we're going to start with the don'ts for soldering iron tip care. Do not ever sand your iron tips. This is a horrible idea. Some people mention this as a potential sort of last resort for oxidized tips. Do not sand your iron tips. And the reason for this is because when you sand them, the iron plating at the tip that is wettable, that allows solder to stick to it, is going to get sanded away. It's pretty thin. So you never want to sand away this iron plating, because underneath it is going to be, chrome or nickel. And not only is this designed to be non-wettable, but it does actually corrode over time with solder. One of the reasons iron is used on the actual working area of the tip is because it's resistant to corrosion when it comes in contact with solder alloys like tin lead and like unleaded solder, stuff like that. So not only are you removing the layer that is designed to be wettable, you're actually exposing the rest of your iron tip here and the other metals used in your iron tip to corrosion and pitting when it comes in contact with molten solder. So never sand the iron tips. Also, never use a wet sponge in order to clean the tips. So a lot of soldering iron kits and things come with these sponges, and it's very common for people to soak these with water and start rubbing the iron tip on the wet sponge. The problem with this is the contrast between soldering temperatures and the temperature of the wet sponge is so great that it's going to thermally shock the tip. And essentially what happens, if we go back to our diagram here, is that this copper core expands and contracts at a faster rate than this iron plating does. So what happens is the iron plating begins to crack when you start thermally shocking the tip like this. And then again, we have the same problem as sanding, where solder is then going to get in between those little cracks and fractures, and it's going to start making contact with these other layers and start pitting them and start corroding them. And then it's going to ruin your iron tip very fast, or at least over time. So using a wet sponge, while it won't immediately destroy your iron tip like sanding will, it's going to over time definitely shorten the lifespan of your iron tips. And not only that, but it's also not extremely effective at getting rid of oxidation and things that we're going to talk about in a bit. A lot of soldering iron tip care comes down to managing oxidation and removing oxidation and replacing it with solder. But I have one more don't for you before we move on. So we have don't sand your iron tip, don't use a wet sponge, and don't leave your iron heating for long periods of time, because what's going to happen is over time, the tip is going to start becoming oxidized. The flux or rosin core of your solder is going to start burning on the tip of the iron. And over time, it's going to just start oxidizing and oxidizing. It's going to be harder and harder to get solder to wet or stick on the tip of the iron. So one of the things that's extremely helpful with this is these newer JBC style irons. Whether it be an actual JBC iron or a JBC style clone like this, you're going to have this induction stand. And the nice thing about this induction stand is when you put your iron back in to the stand, it's actually not going to turn it off. It's going to turn it down to like 100 degrees Celsius or something. You can actually set the idle temperature of your iron. And this does two things. Number one, this makes it so it's not at like 400 degrees Celsius or 375 degrees Celsius for long periods of time. When you're not actively using the iron, it doesn't need to be at that super high temperature, so it decreases the temperature. But the nice thing too is it doesn't decrease it to 0. It's not the same as like with this iron where I was just sort of turning it off when I wasn't using it, and then I'm gonna turn it on again, and then I'm gonna turn it all the way off. So it's just sort of going through this thermal cycle over and over again. Whereas this is sort of a little bit nicer on the tips. It's going to only adjust it down to like 100 Celsius, keep it a little bit warm, not so warm that it's going to start oxidizing the tip over time, but warm enough so that when it heats back up to 400, it's not this huge temperature difference, you know, like it is when you put it on a wet sponge or when you turn it off all the way. So I can't say enough good things about the induction style stands and these JBC style stations because they inherently contribute a lot to maintaining your iron tips. Okay, so now we've talked all about what not to do with your iron tips. What should you be doing with your iron tips? So brass sponges are incredible for iron tip care, and I'm not gonna lie to you guys, this is the only thing I use. I never use a sponge, and my iron tips are always pristine. So I'm telling you, this is all you need. This is all you need in order to maintain your iron tips, along with some nice rosin core solder. So I'll have a link to the brass sponge I use in the description. Do not order brass sponges from AliExpress. Get the Hakko brass sponges or a reputable brand where you know the material that you're getting, because proper brass sponge is going to be brass, and brass is actually softer than the iron plating on your iron tip. So when it's heated and you stab the brass sponge with your iron, it's actually going to be extremely effective at removing oxidation. Along with the heat, it's going to cut through oxidation extremely well and allow your iron tip to wet super well or get solder to stick to it super well. But this brass material is not hard enough to actually cut through the iron plating and cause issues similar to what we were talking about with temperature shocking and fracturing the iron plating. However, on AliExpress, what you'll often find is this steel wool, which is actually just like colored to look like brass wool or plated to look like brass wool. And you can tell the difference between steel wool and proper brass wool because the steel wool is actually magnetic while the brass wool is not. So I have a magnet here, and you can see this actually sticks to my magnet. This should not happen if you have real brass wool. You can see with this real brass wool, I'm not getting any of it to stick to the magnet. This is a neodymium magnet, so it's very strong, and you can see none of it is sticking to it. However, this is clearly sticking to the steel wool. So this stuff is not good to use with your iron. Throw this away and don't get this stuff because steel is harder than the iron plating on your tip. And again, it's going to cause issues where the solder is going to get between those cracks and scrapes on the iron plating, and it's going to start corroding your iron tip, and you don't want that. So don't use this stuff. Get proper brass wool. I'll have a link to the Hakko brass wool I get in the description. It's this stuff right here. It's really cheap for what it is. You get 5 of them for like $24, so it's like less than $5 per brass wool, and these things last you a long time. Like I've been using this one for months and months, and I'm just going to open this here and show you. So at the bottom is all of the solder, and all you got to do is just dump it in the trash and then just start like pulling on the brass sponge and get all of that like excess solder out of there. Obviously use gloves for this because this solder debris is like going to get all over your skin, and especially if you use leaded solder like me, that's no good. But after you're done with this is like brand new brass wool again. You can use this again. Just find a nice clean spot like that, pop it back in your stand, and this stuff is just good as new. The only time I'll start replacing this is when, while you're stabbing this, your iron is going to start like pulling little bits of this out, and that can be, you know, kind of annoying, so I'll replace it at that point. But I just wanted to show you that you can reuse this stuff for months, and I'm soldering daily, and I still stick with the same brass wool for months and months, and I have no issues. So if you just clean it like that, you can make this stuff last for a while as well. But again, make sure you're getting proper brass wool and not steel wool like this, and you'll be good to go. All right, so next on the do's list is to always keep your iron tip tinned. So I have the iron turned on here, and even if you're really excited to like test whatever it is you just soldered or move on to the next component, no matter what you're doing, get in the habit of tinning your iron every time you put it away. So just add a little bit to each side. For example, like here I have a knife tip, so there's actually 2 individual sides on the knife tips, or on any tip shape that has sort of like 2 sides to it, like a chisel tip. This is less the case for like conical or bent conical tips because that's just sort of like, you know, a cylindrical shape. But knife tips like this and chisel tips are going to have like sort of 2 independent sides that I'll generally tin separately. So I'm just going to hit both sides really quick, just like that, and then throw it right back in the stand, and then move on to whatever you're doing. And honestly, what I do is I don't just tin it, I tin it and then I throw it in the brass sponge a little bit, and then tin it one more time and put it away. I do this like all the time. You'll see me do this obsessively sometimes. And this is why my tips stay good for so long, is because I'm constantly tinning my iron before I put it away in the stand, and I'm constantly hitting this brass sponge with it. You always want it to be super clean and shiny like this. You don't ever want to see like brown, burnt flux and stuff on it. So just get this in your routine of soldering, and over time it's just going to become instinct, and you're going to be annoyed when your tip isn't like perfect. You're going to just, stab this thing and keep going. So anyways, I think this is like a really important part of tip care, is to constantly be tinning your iron, constantly clean it with the brass wool, true brass wool. And this is the core of what I do for soldering iron tip care. This is really it. I promise it's this simple. I've been doing this for years, and my iron tips are always ready to go and cause me no issues. The other thing I'll mention is that when you shut your iron off fully, like and you're done for the day, make sure your iron tip has a solid chunk of solder on it. And this just acts as a protective layer on top of that iron plating to prevent from oxidation and stuff like that. When you go to use it the next time, it's going to be ready to go and not cause any issues for you. So store your tips like this with some solder on them, and that way they're going to last quite a bit longer. Now, this is all fine and dandy when you have tips that are broken in, or tips that you've been using for a little while and are easy to wet. But what do you do with a brand new tip? And what do you do, more importantly, when your tip gets oxidized? Because ultimately, no matter how often you're doing this, you're gonna have a time when you put it away and you forgot to put solder on it, and now your tip is oxidized. And if you don't know what I mean by oxidized tip, let me just show you here. I'm gonna just get like this PCB here, and I'm gonna turn my iron up to like 450, and we're just gonna put a bunch of flux down, and I'm gonna clean my iron tip a bunch and not put any new solder on it. So this is a really great way to oxidize your tip really fast. Clean it in the brass wool and then not put any new solder on it. You can see it's very dull. There's not really a lot of like shiny solder on there, and then just throw it in some flux. And what flux ends up doing is, well, at first it's going to actually probably remove some of the oxidation, but what ends up happening over time is that the flux starts to burn, and this is really going to start oxidizing my tip. So here's the difference. You can see on the right hand side we have a shiny and tinned tip, and on the left we have a fully oxidized knife tip that is not shiny whatsoever. And with the tip on the left there, we're gonna have a lot of difficulty getting solder to stick to it. All right, so I'm gonna leave this iron tip out for an extended period of time, and we're gonna watch what happens to it over time. So cutting in here really quick, this is what happens when your iron tip gets put away without cleaning and tinning it like I was showing you. This is exactly what happens to your iron tip. So we're gonna watch for another maybe few minutes and see how bad it gets. All right, so I think this is enough. You can see just how oxidized and bad this looks compared to this nice and tinned C210 tip I have here that's like sort of a similar size. So look at that difference. Like, that's a pretty big difference. So this is what happens when you leave your iron sitting, heating without tinning it, without taking care of it or cleaning it. And now check out what's gonna happen when I try to melt solder onto the tip. It's kind of sticking. It's actually doing decent because I took care of my iron tip. You can see it's just like piecing off like this, and sometimes it just like balls up, and it's not really like sticking nicely to the tip. It looks ugly. Sometimes the oxidation is so bad that it just sort of only balls up on the solder itself, and it doesn't actually stick at all. I didn't really leave it long enough probably, but solder is not going to want to stick to this tip, and it's not going to be good at transferring heat into a board or into a joint. And all you really need to do to get this to look like this is just start hitting the brass sponge, start tinning each side, hit the brass sponge, and do this like 3, 4, 5 times, however many times you need for it to start looking shiny again. And I promise, over time, even if it's really oxidized, you can see what I was talking about there with replacing the brass sponge, but over time, you're gonna get this looking like brand new and shiny again, just like, the one on the left here. I find sort of like dragging each side on the brass wool is a great way of cleaning off excess oxidation or really stubborn oxidation. And then eventually, after a few cycles of that, you're gonna see the tip looks significantly better. We can take a look at it here under the microscope as well. You can see just how much nicer that looks. It's night and day compared to the oxidized tip before. And an iron tip like this is going to help you solder significantly more than an oxidized tip. You can also get this stuff called tip tinner or tip refresher. There's a lot of different names for it out there. And really, I don't personally use this. I find that, enough cycles of the brass wool and solder is good enough to get my tips refreshed if they're very oxidized. The reason I don't personally use tip tinner is because it's extremely aggressive for the iron tip. It's designed to be extremely aggressive so that you can refresh really stubborn oxidized tips. This is the only scenario in which I would recommend you use tip tinner. Don't use this stuff all the time because it's over time going to corrode that iron plating that is designed to be wettable, and it's going to actually start hurting your iron tip more than it is helping. You can try it out as a last resort. I would keep it as that, as a last resort, if your brass wool and solder doesn't do the trick. Personally, not gonna lie, I have never had a situation where this just doesn't work, and therefore I have never bought tip tinner because I've never needed it. I think if you have like a super old iron tip that's like 20 years old and super oxidized, maybe that's a great time to use tip tinner. But otherwise, you know, this works for me, and it's worked for me for 7 or so years, so I think it's a tried and true method. And the other thing I want to mention is that with a brand new tip like this, it can be a little bit difficult to get solder to stick to the tip for similar reasons, especially if you kind of leave it sitting heated for a little while before you apply solder to it. All you have to do is the exact same thing we just talked about like, I don't know, I do it like 10 times when I have a new tip. So just as a recap, don'ts are: don't use sandpaper on your tips, don't use a wet sponge or thermally shock your iron tips, and don't leave your iron heating for long periods of time while you're not using it. And the do's are to use a proper brass sponge, not a steel sponge like this. Keep your tip tinned constantly. Always add solder to the tip and clean it and add solder, put it back. When you go to use it, clean it, add solder, etc., etc. This sort of ritual for me has really been effective at keeping my tips in good shape. And then if the oxidation is really bad, use tip tinner as sort of a last resort. Don't use it over and over again. Use it as a last resort for really stubborn and oxidized tips. And honestly, that's really about it. Again, I'll have links to the brass sponge I use in the description, along with the particular tips I use. They're actually just the Fernersi C245 and C210 tips, and these things last me quite a while, and they're dirt cheap, honestly. Soon, I'm going to be making a comparison between genuine JBC tips, which go around, you know, sometimes $50 per tip. But I do want to see if the genuine JBC style tips are better in any way, if they are more consistent in terms of temperature. So we're going to be doing a couple different tests with those. So keep an eye out for that video. But otherwise, I appreciate you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.